In this lesson, we will discuss what is a mapper. A mapper translates between an object, in the case of Doctrine, an entity object, and a database table. So, for example, we have an entity called ISO country codes with the various properties. We have a corresponding database table, ISO country codes table, with the appropriate database columns. The mapper provides a translation facility which allows our application to work only with the entity. The mapping capability would then make sure that the appropriate information is transmitted between the entity and the database table. Underneath, of course, we have DBAL, or Database Access Layer, which provides the necessary code for the specific PHP database extension which is in use. Doctrine mapping can be accomplished using 4 different techniques. You can use PHP directly. You can define an XML file with the mappings. You can also define a YAML file with the mappings, or most popular, you can simply put what are called annotations into your entity class. Our first example is map using php.php. In this example, we will be using PHP mapping. We've defined an entity class as application entity ISO country codes PHP. Notice on line 13 we are using this entity class. The Doctrine autoloading will find it for us automatically. If we have a look at this class, which is ISO country codes.php, located in the application entity namespace, you'll notice we have the properties which represent the database columns. In order to use this technique, we must define a public static function, load metadata, which takes a class metadata instance as an argument. We can then create an instance of the class metadata builder and then proceed with our mapping arrangements. So you'll notice we've identified the table, an index. We've also identified the primary key with an automatically generated value and the various fields that are in the database table. For example, name, type string, length 128, ISO 2, string, length 2, fixed value. Fixed value means that it will take a CHAR or character data type in the database rather than varchar, which would be name and ISO 3166. Continuing with our example, you'll notice then we create an instance of the static PHP driver and identify the entity class. We then use the entity manager to get the configuration and set the driver to the metadata driver. On line 20, we get the ISO code from the URI. On line 22, we use the entity manager to create the query builder and generate a simple query. We then do a lookup and gather all of the ISO country codes, which are then presented in a form in the form of a select field. To accomplish this, we have a service class called ISO service, which is located in the application service namespace. You'll notice the method select ISO, which loops through the result set and provides a drop-down list of ISO country codes. You'll also notice a method show ISO info, which is used to display information on specific countries. Let's now run the example. So as you can see, we have a drop-down list of country names. If we select a country name, we'll end up with a code. From there, we can do one more lookup and get specific information for that country. Our next example is map using XML.php. The logic is identical to the previous example in that we fetch all possible countries and present them as a drop-down list. After that, if one particular one is chosen, we display information on that country. The difference now is that we are using a different entity class, ISO country codes XML. If you look at this entity class, which is ISO country codes XML.php, located in the application entity namespace, you'll notice it's a very simple class. Instead of using ISO numeric as the ID field, we have now identified this as ID, and we will use our mapper to map ID to isonumeric, which is the actual primary key in the database. Otherwise, the only other methods in this class are simple getters and setters. We are using what's called the simplified XML driver, which was actually provided originally by the Symfony project. We need to identify the namespaces, in this case all under application entity. We then create an instance of the simplified XML driver. We set a global base name, which is arbitrary. we get the configuration from the entity manager and set the MetaDriver implied information. One more thing which needs to be done for this to work is the simplified driver is looking for a file with the extension orm.xml. So it would have the same name as the entity followed by .orm.xml. This is an XML file with a specific mapping. The mapping is a namespace identified through the Doctrine project. We then identify the entity name and the database table in the entity tag. We can also identify any indexes. The ID field or primary key is identified by the ID tag. You'll notice that we've identified the column as isonumeric, whereas the name of the property is ID. This is an auto-generated field which is identified with generator strategy. We then have our various columns. You'll also notice that if we have any options, those are tags within the field tag, in this example fixed true. Let's go ahead now and run this example. So as you can see, the result is exactly the same as the previous example. We get a drop-down list of countries. When we select Choose, we get details on that specific country. Our third example is map using YAML.php. Again, we've used a different entity class, ISO country codes YAML. However, you'll notice it's identical to the one shown in the XML example. All we need to do in this case is to identify properties and getters and setters. As with the XML example, the YAML simplified driver expects to find a file with the same name as the entity with the extension .orm.yml. This file should be in the same directory as the entity class. You'll notice that we have exactly the same information as the XML file, however we're using YAML format. We identify the entity, the type, the database table, any indexes, the primary key, and then finally the various fields. Otherwise, the only difference in the logic in this example is that we're using the simplified YAML driver instead of the simplified XML driver. We specify simplified YAML driver, we set the global base name, and then we set the configuration on the entity manager. One other important consideration for the YAML driver is that you have to make sure that you include the Symfony YAML component in your Composer.json file. So you would simply add an entry Symfony/YAML. You can then use the most recent version, and this would follow the requirement for the Doctrine ORM component. Our last example is map using annotations.php. In this example, we are using an entity class called ISO country codes. Otherwise, the logic is identical to the previous examples. You'll notice the one big difference, however. There's no special configuration for the entity manager. In other words, the entity manager will automatically support annotations. So in our code, all we need to do is to do a lookup of all of the countries, present a drop-down list, and then choose one of the countries. The big difference, of course, is in the entity class itself. In the entity class, we use Doctrine ORM mapping using an alias ORM. This saves quite a bit of space and typing in that when we specify our annotation tags, we can simply say @ORM followed by the actual tag itself. So as you can see, we've got entity tags identifying the entity in the table, and then there are what are called column tags, which map the entity properties to the database columns. If a property is part of the primary key, you would add the ID annotation. We also need to include the appropriate getters and setters. Let's go ahead now and run this final example. So as you can see, the result is exactly the same as the other examples. We get a drop-down list of countries, we choose one, and we get details on that country. So in summary, what is a mapper? A mapper translates between entities and the database table. In Doctrine, there are 4 techniques: using PHP, using XML, YAML, or annotations. Using annotations is inherently supported and is the most popular approach. Please also do not forget, if you're using YAML, you need to include the Symfony YAML component in your Composer.json file.